It was a wet Wednesday afternoon in October 8 years ago when I was sitting in my cubicle of my office on the 5th floor of the Charles Hotel in Harvard Square. I was busy doing my typical multitasking, triaging phone calls, client emails, important projects, trying to adjust for the 16th time my boss's schedule, and knowing that it would mean rearranging her travel one more time, when my cell phone rang. It was my mom. Not now, I'll call her back. It was raining pretty hard, which I knew from peeking out the window when I had stopped in and given a stack of papers to my boss about an hour or so before, but I had forgotten about the weather when I closed her office door and no longer had a direct sightline to the outdoors. Finally, she was in a conference call and I could actually get some work done. Maybe I could spend a little time planning the final tedious tasks of my move that upcoming weekend. Boxes and packing tape, and do I really need to rent a van if I'm just going from JP to Dedham? How many trips can I really make in a Ford Fusion and what can fit in it? How wonderful will it be to just be in my own little house all by myself? And will they let me paint? Again, the phone. Really, Mom? And a text from her too? Okay, well, second time calling, I probably shouldn't ignore it this time. Adam. Dad had a fall, and you need to get to Good Samaritan Hospital. Okay, I'll wrap up here, and I'll get down as soon as I can. So after checking in with a couple of folks to let them know I had to scoot out early, I got into my car. Luckily, I had driven that day, which I didn't usually do, and I left Cambridge at 4:30 p.m. en route to Brockton. It took forever to get there, and I was the last to arrive. And even though I had a feeling, the look on everyone's faces confirmed it. Dad was gone. In fact, he had died before the ambulance even made it to the house. A heart attack, and all attempts at resuscitation had failed. I see in today's gospel passage Jesus running away from death yet again, repeating the pattern in his adult life, what was in his distant childhood memory, getting out of Dodge when Herod is on a rampage. As one of my favorite preachers, Fred Craddock, says, this is a long quote here, the pattern is clear. Jesus moves his place of dwelling from Bethlehem to Egypt, back to the land of Israel, to Nazareth, and to Capernaum in response to an anticipated act of violence by one of the Herods. Each move fulfills Scripture. It is reasonable to conclude that in our text, the news of John's imprisonment poses for Jesus himself another imminent danger. The scene before us, then, is painfully familiar. On television screens and on the covers of news magazines, the picture is a constant one. Innocent people fleeing their homes to escape the terror of violent and inhuman authorities. Jesus is in their company as adult and child, seeking refuge from those who imprison and kill. Matthew's stories are not simply historical recollections, they are current events. King Herod is dead, to be sure, and so are Archelaus and Antipas, but not really. Their successors seem to wait in line to raise the sword against God's Christ and against those whose ways are the ways of God. The gospel continues to have its enemies, and not solely in totalitarian states. Love without partiality, and those who are zealous for racial, cultural, and social purity will rise up in great numbers and from surprising quarters. Teach and practice forgiveness, and the voices of vengeance will come screaming at you. End quote. But there Jesus is, in this place of deep darkness, a place that with a terrible beauty we call the valley of the shadow of death. And it's in this spiritual and metaphorical and sometimes literal place that we find ourselves, that Jesus finds himself when he starts proclaiming the message, turn around. Yes, turn around from death, turn around from danger, turn around from those pathways we love to follow that lead to harm of ourselves and harm of our world. In the face of death and in the place of death, Jesus has already moved in his life, already moved beyond death. Jesus has already overcome death and turned around to announce the kingdom of heaven has come near. It is in him, it is in you, it is in me, it is life abundant and a light in a place of darkness, even a little light that we can let shine. We can let it shine. In the face of death and danger, our perspective and resolve change. It changes to follow the great light that brings hope and true peace. We abandon, we even jettison really, what is unnecessary with surprising clarity and speed. In the face of death and danger, Jesus turns around and goes to the people. He doesn't need to or want to risk arrest and death right now. Did he ever really want to? Jesus goes back to Galilee and finds himself pondering big questions while he walks along the beach. I imagine he's thinking about what his next move is when he stumbles across a familiar sight, people fishing with their nets and boats in the lake. And he speaks up, he says to Peter and Andrew, and soon after James and John and all the rest, and he says, follow me. And immediately, they do. It sounds astonishing. They abandoned their nets. They abandoned their boats. James and John even abandoned their father, and they go and follow Jesus. Maybe they had heard of him before. After all, he was a local. Maybe they were just ready. In any case, they turn around and they follow this teacher, the one with a message about the kingdom close by and fishing for people. Their decision, to me, has always seemed so simple, or at least the story is simplified. I love this reflection by the Reverend Dr. Alicia McKenzie about what she calls these snap decisions of the disciples. She says, maybe snap decisions aren't as snap as we think. Every decision takes place in a context. In all four Gospels, people made what looks like a snap decision to become a disciple of Jesus. But things look a little different when we look at their decisions in the flow of that particular Gospel story. Then, it looks like the snap decision may have been one step in an ongoing process. It seems likely that the disciples had been thinking about Jesus for a while and about what the impact of following him might be. End quote. No doubt the disciples had been familiar with death and possibly even felt like it was coming for them sooner rather than later. We don't know if Jesus called many that day or a few, but we know at least these ones answered the call. They made a snap decision to turn their lives around, to turn their focus around, to leave their nets behind and to follow. They moved quickly, but like Reverend McKenzie says, it was not a decision made without context. I think about the image of these fishermen abandoning their nets and how evocative that is. So as we prayed in our prayer for grounding in God's grace this morning, how many of us are hemmed in by nets of our own making? How often do we find ourselves actually mending those nets instead of trying to break free from them? How often are we making ourselves more comfortable in our minds when we don't realize we're actually suffocating ourselves? How many nets have others set up for you to get tangled in, to keep you tied down? How many nets have you piled up around yourself, let others place on top of you so that you feel crushed by the weight of it all, so that you can barely see light through the darkness of all the nets? We find ourselves in those places of crushing nets, those valleys of shadow, all too often. Many of us feel that when we think about the suffocating effects of climate catastrophe, or the aching rift of partisan American politics, we feel ourselves in those places. There's a card game. It's called Go Wish. And I've seen this game, and it helps people think about the fragility of the human condition. To give you some context, I learned about this game in the context of a class on chaplaincy with folks who are facing decisions nearing the end of life. And there are different ways to play the game, but essentially it goes like this. You get dealt a bunch of cards. And on each one of them is a phrase of something that might be important to you, like having my family with me, being kept clean, having my funeral arrangements made, being at peace with God, being mentally aware, being able to help others, having someone who will listen to me, keeping my sense of humor. You think about the end of your life, and you rank these cards in different piles. Very important, somewhat important, not important to me. And then everything that's not very important is taken away. So you have some cards left, and then you're told you got to take 2 more away. 2 more. You only have 3 left now. I'm not trying to be macabre or make a game of death. Really, quite the opposite. What Go Wish demonstrates, what I see in this gospel passage, is that a close encounter with the power and reality of death puts in relief a light and hope that helps us move with precision and clarity and conviction. With his cousin, his fellow witness, and his baptizer in jail, Jesus, he cannot wait to keep that message alive. Turn around, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. Turn around, for the promises of God are closer than you think. Turn around because you will find that light in front of you, that light within you, shines in every dark place. Turn around because it's time to move in a new direction, that direction that you always knew you had to go in. Speaking of a different direction, as Mrs. Banks sings in the movie Mary Poppins, cast off the shackles of yesterday, shoulder and shoulder into the fray. Now she's singing as someone who's rallying for women's voting in England in the 19-teens. And her song speaks with wisdom. Wisdom, I think, knowing that at the same time she is abandoning those shackles that have held her down in the past, while knowing that her goal that she seeks is not real yet. It's with that kind of conviction that we move in when we fight for justice in our day. A group of Covenanters, as you heard in our announcements, will join others tomorrow at a rally at the now under construction Weymouth Compressor Station site. And we do so with that light of faith in our hearts. We gather together with people of faith, people of no particular faith, to be as one in this fight, shoulder to shoulder into the fray. As we make an action in our pronouncement, not of climate catastrophe, but you've heard it before, climate jubilee. Climate jubilee as we turn this world around from a fossil fuel-based energy economy. In this spiritual place of the shadow of death, in destruction that we know is likely for our planet, in the shadow of our current trajectory, we turn to that light. And so, as those who try to follow Jesus' call, we work through our prayers and our actions, our meetings, our plannings, all of them sacred acts of worship, to abandon any net of death, personal, societal, to turn around toward life. Maybe your path in following Jesus leads you to a place of protest. Your path has led you here with us today, and I don't think that's an accident. After my dad's death, I had a renewed sense of clarity and life purpose. I ended up leaving that job over the next several months, and I turned around toward people, toward nonprofit work, toward ministry as a vocation. Decisions after decisions snapped into place over a long period of time that have led me to this time and place. And I'm clear about that light of life, that spirit of hope and truth and challenge that I know most clearly from following the teachings of that enigmatic man, Jesus. And I'll do my best to follow because I know that following the call has already moved me beyond the reach of death and into the abundance of life. And on that path, I aim and I am willing to follow with wild abandon. Amen.